Chapter 11. The seventh submerged sphere, or the circle of Saturn. Friends gathered here once again, we should talk profoundly in relation to the submerged sphere of Saturn. Certainly, we are not talking about eternal condemnation or endless punishments. Unquestionably, eternal condemnation in itself does not exist, and every punishment, regardless of how serious it might be, has to have a limit beyond which happiness reigns. We differ radically in that sense with the clerical orthodoxy. Indubitably, the involutive processes of life, carried out in the entrails of the earth, in the infradimensions submerged beneath the geological cortex of our world, conclude with the second death, after which the liberated essence will inevitably have to reinitiate new processes of a completely evolving nature once the pristine purity of the psychic material has been restored. Therefore, our opposition to the dogma of an absolutely eternal condemnation is obvious and evident. Our way of comprehending the expiation of faults is obvious. We could never conceive of an expiatory debt, as grave as it might be, that would not come to an end at some point. It is clear that divine justice would never fail. Every fault, as serious as it might be, has its exact mathematical expiatory equivalent. It is not possible to pay for more than is owed, and if the divinity collected more than. This is how I have begun our talk of today, my dear friends, in the manner of a preamble before entering the subject of the submerged sphere of Saturn, with the unavoidable purpose that you comprehend our esoteric, occultist point of view, which is radically opposed to all sectarian dogmatism. In our past lecture, we studied closely the sixth Dantestic circle, and today it is convenient that we daringly penetrate the seventh circle, or the circle of Saturn. If we carefully read Dante's Divine Comedy, we will find said region converted into an ocean of blood and fire. Allow us the liberty of saying that this point of view is completely allegorical or symbolic. Yes, it does signify the concrete and definite fact that in the Saturnine region there definitely prevails a certain reddish, bloody color, which highly characterizes violent animal passion. When we speak of colors, we should know that above the solar spectrum, in the superior dimensions of nature and of the cosmos, shines the entire ultraviolet range, and that below the solar spectrum there fatally shines the infrared range. The latter is characteristic of nature beneath the geological cortex of our world. In this manner, therefore, that passionate bloody red color of the submerged Saturnine region could not be exhibited in our three-dimensional world of Euclid. Said color finds its opposite in a similar one in the ultraviolet range, on the mentioned three-dimensional region. It is interesting to know that everyone who joins the seventh Dantestic circle carries in his radiant aura the abominable bloody color, which certainly makes him related to that submerged zone of our planet Earth. The seventh Dantestic circle is, therefore, the dwelling of the violators of nature, of the violators of art, the frauds, the violent ones against God, the violent person against himself, against his own property, and against the property of others. On moving around with the astral body, consciously and positively, in that submerged region, I was able to witness the reigning violence in such a frightening zone of bitterness. I still remember two very notable demons, whom I approached diplomatically with the purpose of not hurting anyone's susceptibilities and provoking unnecessary psychological reactions. The latter pronounced themselves against the cosmic Christ. They denied him emphatically, feeling perversely satisfied with their miserable satanic condition. Violence reigned everywhere in the bloody submerged atmosphere. Unnecessary destructions, frightening blows against things, against persons, against everything were seen here, there, and everywhere. I felt as if the Saturnine influence, with its forces that were definitely centrifugal, proposed to disintegrate everything, to reduce to cosmic dust persons, furniture, doors, etc., in that region. I was very astonished on finding there a very respectable creature whose eyes still carried the soft light of day. It was a very famous doctor, a true Samaritan, who in life had only proposed to heal patients with true love and without any exploitation. What I am saying may cause astonished. Many could object, telling me, how is it possible that he, being such a good person, would end up in the region of evil? Even the matter of life and death could be argued. The good man in question obviously still lives, is still breathing under the sun. Then why does he dwell in the seventh Dantestic circle? It is necessary to answer such enigmas, to clarify, inquire with precision, to inquire and to investigate. If we think of the multiplicity of the I, it is not strange that any of these psychic aggregates related with the crime of violence against nature is living in its corresponding submerged region, even when the personality still lives on the face of the earth. Obviously, if that doctor does not dissolve the pluralized I, he will have to descend with the involutive wave in the entrails of the world, to stand out very especially in the seventh Dantestic circle. There is much virtue in scoundrels, and there is much evil in the virtuous. Once the cycle of 108 existences that is assigned to every soul on the face of the earth concludes, it is unquestionable that one descends with the involutive wave, even when one has beautiful virtues. It is not beside the point for us to remember Brunetto Latini right now, that noble gentleman who taught the Florentine Dante with so much love. The path that leads to the immortality of man, a noble creature who was submerged in that abyss because of violence against nature. Question: Master, could you explain to us when it is that we commit a crime against nature? Answer: with the greatest of pleasure I hasten to answer the lady who has asked the question. Violence against nature exists when we carry out violence against the sexual organs. Such a crime exists when a man forces his wife to copulate when she is not in the disposition to do so. Such a crime exists when a woman forces the man to copulate when he is not in the disposition to do so. Such a crime exists when the woman forces herself to copulate while her organism is not really in favorable conditions to do so. Such a crime exists when the man forces himself, doing violence against himself, to effect the coition, while his body is not in an apt condition to do so. Such a crime exists when the woman forces herself to effect the copulation, while her organism is not in really favorable conditions. Such a crime exists in those who commit the crime of sexual violation, the possession of another person against the will of the latter. Since crime also hides in the rhythm of verse, it is not unusual that violence against nature is committed when one forces the phallus to become erect, when the latter is not really in favorable con for coition. Violence against nature exists when, with the pretext of practicing sexual magic, or even with the best of intentions of attaining self-realization, the male forces himself to carry out the chemical copulation, or forces his wife to do so because of this purpose, while the creative organs are not in the precise amorous moment and in favorable conditions which are indispensable for copulation. Violence against nature exists in those ladies who, needing inner self-realization, violate their own nature, forcing themselves pitilessly to carry out copulation, while they are certainly not in the required conditions to do so. Violence against nature exists in masturbators or in those who carry out the chemical copulation while the woman is menstruating. Violence against nature exists when the spouses carry out the sexual union while the woman is pregnant. Violence against nature exists when the Vajroli Mudra is practiced vigorously several times during the day or night, when the sexual organs are not really in favorable and harmonious conditions. Violence against nature exists when sexual magic is practiced 2 consecutive times, violating the laws of the creative magnetic pause. Question: Master, if the spouse does not have complete potency and is practicing sexual magic, is nature also being violated in this manner? Answer: with great pleasure, I hasten to answer the gentleman who asked the question. It so happens that the organ that is not used atrophies. If any male were to remain abstinent in a radical and absolute manner, it is ostensible that he would harm himself because he would become impotent. Obviously, if such a male were to desire to be cured of such a harmful evil, he could well achieve this by practicing sexual magic, the connection of the phallus and the uterus without ejaculation, the semen. It is clear that in principle, such a connection results almost impossible, due precisely to the lack of erection of the phallus. However, on attempting it, letting the phallus come close to the uterus with the mutual exchange of caresses, there does not exist violation against nature, but rather erotic medical therapeutics, which is indispensable to carry out the cure. In the beginning, this type of patient can use some type of clinical medical treatment based on the advice of the physician, with the precise purpose of achieving the first sexual connections. It is ostensible that if the couple withdraws before the orgasm to avoid the ejaculation of semen, the latter is reabsorbed into the organism, extraordinarily fortifying the sexual system, the exact result being the cure. In this entire process, I repeat, there is no violation against nature. Question: Master, when you talk of violence against nature, do you exclusively refer to the violence of the human organism? Answer: distinguished friend, I want you to know in a clear and definitive manner that when we talk of violence against nature, we are referring in an emphatic manner to all types of sexual violence, clearly specifying the one referring to the sexual organs of human beings. I do not want to say with this that there does not exist other types of violence against nature. If someone forced, for example, the inferior creatures of nature to undergo contrived copulations, violating free will, there would exist violence against nature. If someone artificially inseminated animals, as it is the custom today, there would exist violence against nature. There exists violence against nature when we adulterate vegetables and fruits in the famous hybrids that have been invented by the know-it-alls of this black age of Kali Yuga. There exists violence against nature when we castrate or when we cause animals to be castrated. There are then countless transgressions that are of this type of violence against nature. Oh, friends, ladies and gentlemen that listen to me, people that receive this Christmas message of 1973-1974, remember that transgression also hides among the incense of the temples, among the beautiful paintings that the painter sets on his canvas. Transgression also hides. Transgression also hides among the most delightful harmonies with which music delights us on this planet Earth. That transgression also hides among the perfume of the petition that is delightfully whispered in the temples. Transgression dresses itself as a saint, a martyr, an apostle, and even when it seems incredible, it disguises itself with priestly robes and officiates at altars. Remember, friends, ladies and gentlemen, Guido Guerra, cited by Dante, grandson of the chaste Gualdrata, noble sire that during his life did so much with his talent and with his sword. Also remember Tegiaio Aldobrandi, for whose voice the world should be thankful. Noble males that now live in this 7th infernal circle because of the transgression of violence against nature. Question: Master, if we disintegrate the I of violence against nature, or almost all the I that have our essence bottled up, but we still have some left, will we also fall into any of these Dantestic circles? Answer: distinguished lady, I'm happy to hear your question, which is quite opportune. Someone could eliminate from his psyche those psychic aggregates related to the transgression of violence against nature, and still fall, however, into any of the other Dantestic circles. While the animal ego exists in us, it is obvious that we are sure candidates for the abyss and the second death. Question, Master, if we have already arrived at the last of the 108 existences that have been assigned to every human being, and we are working on the path of the razor's edge, would we be given another opportunity to finish our work? Answer. Esteemed lady, I am pleased to hear your question. Let it be known with complete clarity that the laws of nature are not governed by tyrants, but by just and perfect beings. If someone, in spite of having finished their cycle of 108 existences, enters the path of the razor's edge and disembodies, while on the real path, obviously he would be helped by being assigned new existences with the purpose of him to achieving his intimate self-realization. However, if he deviated from the secret path, if he complained, if he did not dissolve ego and relapsed into his same transgressions, inevitably he would fail into the abyss of perdition. Question. Because of what has previously been said during the course of this lecture, I have arrived at the conclusion that once we involute in the atomic abysses of nature, we are really inhabitants of all the Dantistic circles of our planetary organism. Am I right, Master? I tell the gentleman that asked this question that he is certainly right. When someone enters into the submerged involution of nature, he descends in time slowly from circle to circle, standing out very especially in that zone, specifically where his worst transgression is found. Question. Master, what can you tell us of homosexuals and lesbians? Do they commit violence against nature? Answer. Distinguished sir, your question seems to me very interesting. It is urgent to comprehend that homosexuals and lesbians inevitably submerge into the seventh Dantistic circle, or the circle of Saturn, precisely because of the transgression of violence against nature. I want you to comprehend that this type of degenerated persons, enemies of the third logos, are really lost cases, seeds that do not germinate. Question, Master, do lesbians and homosexuals coins into the world as such because of karmic law, or does the engendering of such children have some hereditary relationship? Which of these two factors predominates? I hear the question that the international Gnostic missionary Efrain Villegas Quintero asks here in the patriarchal headquarters of the Gnostic movement in Mexico City. Ladies and gentlemen, it is convenient to know that such humanoids that in former lives violently precipitated themselves down the path of sexual degeneration, obviously involuting from existence to existence, finally appear as homosexuals or lesbians before entering the infernal worlds. Lesbianism and homosexuality are then the result of the degeneration of preceding lives, a fatal karmic consequence, that is all. Question. Master, if a lesbian or a homosexual was for a moment able to have knowledge of their punishment because of the karma of their degeneration and ask the law for help, would the law be able to concede them the favor of their returning to their normal state, or would they not have sufficient strength to ask for this favor? Answer. Ladies and gentlemen, there exists a proverb that says, ask God, but also help yourself. Divine mercy is side by side with justice, but deeds, not good reasons, are love. If any of these infrasexuals degenerates were to truly repent, let them demonstrate it with concrete, clear, and definite deeds. Let them immediately marry someone of the opposite sex, and let them really start on the path of authentic and legitimate sexual regeneration. It is right for this type of delinquent to cry, pray, and beg, but let him also show his repentance with deeds. Only in this manner is salvation possible for these types of creatures. However, it is very difficult for homosexuals and lesbians to have courage, a true longing for betterment. Undoubtedly, one is dealing with completely degenerated people in which certain areas of the brain are no longer working, rotten seeds, where it is impossible to find a longing for regeneration. Some persons of this type have made of their transgression a mystique, disguised with the attire of sainthood. The latter exponents of human poverty are even worse and more dangerous. We should not, then, forge illusions about these persons. They are lost cases, abortions of nature, complete failures. Question: Master, do those who reject the opposite sex have every hope of realization lost, or does some door remain open? Answer: Distinguished friend, listen. Infrasexualism is symbolized in the ancient Kabbalah with the two women of Adam, Lilith and Nahema. Lilith in itself frankly allegorizes the most monstrous of sexual degeneration. In the sphere of Lilith, we find many solitary hermits, cloistered monks and nuns who mortally hate sex. We also find in the cited sphere all those women who took abortive and who murdered their newly born creatures, true hyenas of perversity. Another aspect of the sphere of Lilith corresponds to the pimps, homosexuals, and lesbians. Unquestionably, those who reject sex violently, as well as those who abuse it, falling into homosexuality and lesbianism, are lost cases, terribly malignant creatures. For these types of people, all doors are dosed except one, that of repentance. The sphere of Nahema is represented by another type of violence against nature, the irredeemable fornicators, the fornicators of abomination, etc. Persons who find themselves quite defined as the Don Juan type, or Casanova type, and even the devil type, which is the worst of the worst. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now continue talking a little about violence against God. On reaching this point of our talk, we want to remember Kapaneo, the ancient one of Crete, one of the 7 kings that laid siege to Thebes and who now lives in the submerged zone of Saturn, beneath the geological cortex of our Earth. The Florentine Dante, disciple of Virgil, the great poet of Mantua, in his Divine Comedy, cites this terrible case related with this particular theme. That shadow screamed, "That which in life I was, in death I am." Though Jupiter tire out his armor, who supplied his wrathful hand with the sharp thunderstone that in my last day smote me through the side, though he tire all the rest out, one by one, in Mongibel's black Stethi, and break them quite, crying, "To aid, Vulcan, lay on, lay on," as once before he cried at Phlegra's fight. Yea, though he crush me with his omnipotence, no merry vengeance shall his heart delight. The arrogance and pride of the violent against the divine in the 7th submerged infradimension is the worst torture. There exists violence against the divinity when we do not obey superior orders, when we attempt against our own life, when we blaspheme wrathfully. There exist many subtle ways of violence against the divine. Undoubtedly, the violent person against God is he who does not want anything to do with mystical or spiritual matters, he who assumes that he can exist without divine mercy, and at the bottom of his soul rebels against everything that has the smell of divinity. There exists violence against God in that self-sufficient person that smiles stupidly in a skeptical manner when he hears of matters that in some way have to do with the spiritual aspects of life. There exists violence against God in the intellectual rascals, in those know-it-alls that deny all spiritual possibilities to man, in those who believe that they have monopolized universal knowledge, in the models of wisdom, in the learned ignoramuses who not only ignore but also ignore that they ignore, in the iconoclasts that raise to the ground when they analyze religious principles, but who leave their followers without a new spiritual base. There exists violence against God in the Marxist-Leninists, pseudo-sages that have taken away the spiritual values from humanity. There comes to memory in these moments an encounter with Karl Marx in the submerged worlds I met him in. Those tenebrous regions, that person had awakened in evil and for evil. However, he was a fallen bodhisattva. He followed Lenin like an evil shadow, unconsciously, profoundly asleep. I questioned Marx with the following words. It has been many years that you disembodied, that your body became dust in the tomb, however. I find you alive in these regions. Where did your materialist dialectic lead to? This person, looking at his wristwatch, did not dare answer me. He turned around and left, but a few meters away he laughed sarcastically and horrifyingly. Through intuition I was able to sense the living essence of such a laugh. In it was the answer that we could summarize with the following phrase. That dialectic was nothing more than a farce, a dish to fool the unwary. It is curious to note that when Karl Marx disembodied, he received the religious funerary honors of a great rabbi. In the first international communist gathering, Karl Marx stood up, saying, "Gentlemen, I am not Marxist." There was then surprise among the audience, loud shouts, and from there many political sects were born, the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, anarchists, anarchist unionists, etc. In this manner, it is interesting to know that the first enemy of Marxism was Karl Marx. In a magazine from Paris, one can read the following: through the triumph of the world proletariat, we will create the universal Soviet Socialist Republic, with the capital in Jerusalem, and we will own all the riches of the nations, so that the prophecies of our holy prophets of the Talmud be fulfilled. Certainly these are not the phrases of a materialist or those of any atheist. Marx was a Jewish religious fanatic. I do not want in this talk to criticize political matters. I am emphatically referring to essentially occult matters. Karl Marx, moved assuredly by religious fanaticism, invented a destructive weapon to reduce to cosmic dust all the religions of the world. Such a weapon is without a doubt a jargon that would never withstand an in-depth analysis. I refer to the materialist dialectic. The intellectual rascals know very well that for the elaboration of such a deceiving dish, of such a farce, Marx used Hegel's materialistic dialectic. Evidently, he took from this work all the metaphysical values that were given it by its author, and with what was left be elaborated his dish. It is not superfluous to repeat in this talk that Marx, as the author of such a lie, of such a farce, of such communistic dialectic, never believed in it, and because of this was not inconvenienced in confessing his feelings in view of the whole assembly. Gentlemen, I am not Marxist. Undoubtedly, this gentleman only fulfilled one of the protocols of Zion that says, it does not matter if we have to fill the world with materialism and repugnant atheism. The day when we triumph, we will teach the religion of Moses universally, coded and in a dialectic empener, and we will not permit any other religion in the world. With this, I do not want to condemn any race in particular. I am frankly referring to some Semitic personages with Machiavellian plans. These are Marx, Lenin, Stalin, etc. From a rigorously occultist point of view, I could evince that the mentioned fallen bodhisattva struggled for divinity in his own way, using an astute weapon to destroy the other religions. Marx was a priest, a rabbi of the Jewish religion, faithful devotee of the doctrine of his ancestors. What does astonish is the credulity of naive persons that, believing themselves erudite, fall into the skeptical trap set by Karl Marx. These naive persons of the Marxist-Lenin materialist dialectic obviously became violent against the divinity, and because of such a motive entered the seventh Dantistic circle. Question: Venerable Master, in the Masonic order to which I belong, it is said that religion helps man to die, and that Masonry helps man to live. Therefore, I believe that the majority of Masons that I know do not know what religion is and confuse it with something totally negative. Since we are dealing with violence against God, would you like to give us the correct concept of what religion means? Answer: very well, my friend who asks the question, and those persons who listen to me. Religion comes from the Latin word religare, that means to relink the soul with Go Masonry, is not properly said a religion. It is more a fraternity of the universal type. However, it would be recommended that such a deserving institution study the science of religion. The latter religion is precisely Gnosticism in its purest form, wisdom of a divine nature, profound analytical esotericism, transcendental occultism. Question. Permit me to insist, Master, since I have heard in another talk within the Gnostic teachings that the universe was created by 7 Masonic lodges, and this undoubtedly links primitive Masonry with the Father, this being the reason why I have the concept that, in synthesis, Masonry is the common denominator of all religions, and therefore it comes from Gnosis. Could you clarify this for me? Answer. Dear sir, those who have profoundly studied the masonry of a Reagan or lead heater know very well that occult esoteric Masonry existed not only under the porticos of the Temple of Jerusalem, but also in ancient E and in submerged Atlantis. Unfortunately, that honorable institution entered into the involutive circle with the age of Kali Yuga, or the Iron Age, in which we actually find ourselves. However, it is ostensible that in the future, great race, it will have a brilliant mission to fulfill precisely when the powerful esoteric civilizations of the past resurrect. We do not deny the divine origin of such an institution. We already know that the 7 cosmocrators officiate with holy liturgy in the dawn of the great day, when they fecundated the chaotic matter so that life would come forth. From century to century, through the different cosmic rounds, the workshops become denser and denser each time, until they finally arrive at the aspect in which they are actually found. We recommend to the Masonic brothers to study in depth the esotericism of Solomon and the divine wisdom of the land of the pharaohs. It is necessary, it is urgent that the Masonic brothers do not fall into the Marxist-Leninist skepticism, the dialectic of fools, that they do not pronounce themselves against the divinity, because this, besides being contrary to an esoteric order of divine origin, will inevitably lead them to the 7th Dantestic circle, the tenebrous region of the violent against God. Question. Venerable Master, how does one classify the concrete case of some Gnostics who, believing that they are identified with the doctrine of the Christ, are also identified with the opposite side, which is the Marxist atheism? Answer. Distinguished gentlemen, it so happens that there never ceases to exist in the currents of an occultist or esoteric type some sincere elements who truly aspire to work for a better world. It is unquestionable that they, poisoned by red propaganda and desiring to create here in the Western world the Soviet paradise, work with enthusiasm to achieve the total realization of that great aspiration. They are sincerely mistaken persons and people with magnificent intentions, but mistaken. Remember that the path that leads to the abyss is paved with good intentions. If these people would live for a while as workers in the Soviet Union, I am sure that on returning to this region of the Western world, they would demonstrate furiously as anti-communist. It is very interesting to know that in the Western Hemisphere, there are more communists than in the Soviet Union. What happens is that there, behind the Iron Curtain, the people already know the communist reality. They have lived it, and therefore they cannot be fooled by the red propaganda. On the other hand, since here we still do not have a government of a Marxist-Leninist type, the red agitators can play with the unwary, in the same manner that the cat plays with the mouse before devouring it. From a rigorously esoteric point of view, we can affirm in an emphatic manner the following. In the submerged worlds, in the tenebrous regions of the 7th Dantestic infradimension, the communists dress in black robes. They are really personages of the left side, priests of Ch.10 and air magic. I will conclude by saying that the Venerable Great White Lodge has classified Marxism-Leninism as authentic and legitimate black magic. Those who have seen the secret path that leads to final liberation cannot be active members in the ranks of the left side without committing the transgression of violence against God. Question. Dear Master, although all of us know what fraud is, and that it is always related to matters of an economic type, does this transgression, which is purged in the seventh Dantestic circle, include other types of fraud? Answer. Friends, there exist many types of fraud, and it is good to clarify all of this. Dante symbolized fraud as a horrifying, tenebrous image. Dante paints the monster of fraud for us in the following manner. His face was of a just male, so kind was his appearance, his exterior and the rest of his body. That of a poisonous snake. He had two abominable faces full of hair to the armpits and the back, chest, and ribs of such a manner. Dante says that on the tail of that figure there existed a terrible needle. This symbol expresses very well the transgression of fraud. Let us think for a moment on the varying snares of colors with which the fraudulent encompasses his victim, on the venerable countenance with which the fraudulent person appears, on his body of a poisonous snake, on his horrible clutches, and on the needle with which he hurts his victims. The types of frauds are so varied that one is really astonished. There exists fraud in he who forms an esoteric circle and then abandons it. There exists fraud in he who opens a Gnostic center and then bewilders with his transgressions. Being in love with the neighbor's wife, seducing with the purpose of practicing sexual magic, committing adultery in hiding, desiring the Isis in the temple, exploiting the brothers of the sanctuary, promising what he cannot, few one preaching what he does not fulfill, doing the reverse of what is taught, creating scandals, drinking alcohol in front of the surprised devotees, etc. There exists fraud in the man who promises matrimony to a woman and does not fulfill his word, in the woman who gives her word to a man and then disappoints him by falling in love with another man, in a head of household who promises his son or daughter such and such a gift or such and such help, and then does not fulfill his promise, etc., etc., etc. All these forms of fraud are violence against art. That is why Dante allegorizes it with the frightful monster with a venerable countenance. There exists fraud in the individual who borrows and does not return money. There exists fraud in the sellers of lottery and gambling games, since the victims, convinced that they can win, lose their money and feel deceived. Question. Venerable Master, we understand that the seventh Dantestic circle is denser than all the former circles, so we would like you to explain the material constitution of such an infradimension. Answer. Friends, the seventh submerged region, or the circle of Saturn, is of a surprising material density, since each atom in this submerged region possesses in its abdomen 672 atoms of the absolute. Obviously, this specific type of atoms is too heavy, and because of this reason, the seventh submerged region is too gross and painful. Since an equal number of laws, 672, governs this tenebrous submerged zone beneath the geological cortex of our world, life becomes intolerable, difficult, terribly complicated, and frighteningly violent. Question. Master, I would like to know if the element or elements in which the inhabitants of said circle move in is also not seen by them, and if they think that they are doing very well. Answer. Honorable friends, I want you to know that this cavernous region of our planet is a mixture of mineral and fire. However, there, the flames are only known by their effects, by the violence, by the rough, instinctive, and brutal blows. I repeat what I had said before at the beginning of this talk. What Dante symbolized with blood is exclusively the bloody color of sexual violence in the aura of the lost ones, and in the infrahuman atmosphere of this zone. Undoubtedly, an inhabitant of this Saturnine region would never think bad of himself. They always suppose that they march on the path of righteousness and of justice. Some of them know they are demons, but they console themselves with the idea that so are all human beings. However, those persons who do not ignore that they are demons would never admit to the idea that they are bad, since they firmly believe they are good persons, just and uprights. If someone were to reprimand them because of their trance, if someone were to admonish them, if they were called to repent, they would feel offended, slandered, and would react with acts of violence. Chapter 10, the sixth submerged sphere, or the circle of Jupiter. Distinguished friends, let us study tonight with complete clarity the sixth Dantestic circle, or that of Jupiter, submerged beneath the epidermis of the planet Earth. Unquestionably, this infradimensional region is even denser than the 5 previous ones due to its atomic constitution. It is good to know that each atom of the sixth Dantestic circle carries in its abdomen 576 atoms of the sacred absolute sun. Undoubtedly, such types of extremely heavy atoms are the causa causorum of a tremendous materialism. People that live submerged in this infernal region are obviously controlled by 576 laws, which aim of their existence is something very complicated and difficult. Time becomes frighteningly slow in this region. Each minute seems to be a century, and therefore life becomes tedious and intolerable. If we carefully analyze the Jupiterian vibration in its planetary transcendental aspect, we discover this mysterious force that gives the scepter to kings and the mitre to hierarchs of diverse confessional religions. The planet Jupiter in infinite space is then extraordinary, mystic, regal, and sublime. Its antithesis in these submerged infradimensions beneath the geological cortex of our world is in fact converted into the dwelling of the materialistic atheists, enemies of the eternal. The blasphemous also live in these regions, those that hate everything that could have the taste of divinity, and the heretics, those that cultivate the dogma of separatism. One feels filled with pain on contemplating, as did Dante, so many mitred skeptics and atheists stuck in the sepulchre of their own passions, hatreds, and limitations. When we think of the great legislators, sovereigns, and lords that rule the social conglomerates, we obviously discover tyrants and little tyrants that originate complications and pain here, there, and everywhere. The result of such evil proceedings corresponds exactly with the sixth Dantestic circle. It is not surprising, then, that in this tenebrous region of the dwelling of Pluto, the esoterist investigator finds all types of these hierarchs that abuse their power. It is clear that such people therefore suffer the unspeakable. Jupiter, as a paternal friend, always generous, has its evil antithesis in those terrible heads of households that, having lots of goods, deny food, shelter, and clothing to their children. Undoubtedly, it is in the sixth evil abysmal region where those sinning shadows find their dwelling place after death. The consciousness of the investigator is moved upon contemplating the heads of households submerged in the tenebrous Jupiterian region. However, what is more curious is that they always thought themselves virtuous, just, and kind in this world under the light of the sun, and some of them were even profoundly religious. There is also in the sinister dwelling beads of households that aspired to the intimate self-realization of the being in spite of all their cruelties. Their peers believed them to be good. Their conduct was apparently upright from the doors of their house outwards, it is clear, although within their dwelling there was crying and crying. They were extraordinary pious persons with feigned humilities and comedian poses, unbearable vegetarians of the type who make of food a religion of the kitchen. I would call them hypocrites, Pharisees, whitened sepulchres, using the tone of the great Kabir Jesus. However, this would never be said by their followers or those that would have seen them in beautiful halls of a pseudo-esoteric or pseudo-occultist type. It is also not strange to find in the sixth submerged infradimensional region heads of households that were very honest and sincere, but also terribly mistaken. What they should have done, they did not do, and what they should not have done, they did. Some of these men were extraordinarily fanatic in the world where they lived, and with sticks and beatings they taught religion to their children, as if the latter could be learned with whippings. Evil subjects that darkened homes, embittering the life of their relatives. Jupiter, generous as always, munificent and altruist, has to have its contrast beneath the epidermis of the earth, in the sixth submerged infradimension. What would be the antithesis of generosity? Egotism, usury, embezzlement that is obvious. It is not strange then to find in this infrahuman region he who monopolizes all the goods of the earth, such as San Gabriel and his followers. In this manner, every religious antithesis, every Jupiterian contrast, has to be inevitably found in the sixth infernal circle beneath the epidermis of the earth. Question. Dear Master, I have observed that you mention that time is tremendously long, that the minutes seem centuries due to the great density of this submerged region of Jupiter. Is time long because of the sufferings, or are the sufferings long because of the time? Answer. Distinguished gentleman who asks the question, allow me to inform you that time only exists from the merely subjective point of view, because it certainly does not have an objective reality. Starting from this basic principle, we arrive at the logical conclusion that time is a submerged subconscious creation. Unquestionably, time in each infraconscious zone, or better said, in that inhuman part that exists in each of us, becomes slower each time in the most profound depths of materialism. In other words, I will say the following. In the merely intellective level, time is not as slow as in the deeper subconscious levels. That is, the more subconscious the region is where we live, the slower time will be. It will take on a greater appearance of reality. Here in the physical world where we live, on the surface of the earth and in the sunlight, there are minutes that seem to be centuries, and there are centuries that seem to be minutes. Everything depends on the mood that we are in. It is clear that in complete happiness, 12 hours seem to be a minute. It is obvious that an instant of supreme pain seems to be a century. Let us now think on the abyss, on the submerged abysmal regions, on the city of Dante, the cursed city at the bottom of tenebrous Tartarus. There the lost ones feel that each minute becomes centuries of abominable bitterness. I think that now the gentleman that asked the question will understand my answer in depth. Question. That is exactly so, Master. But as you mentioned, states of consciousness as subconscious, unconsciousness, and infraconscious, is this perhaps saying that when we talk of infradimensions, the latter is also referring to states of consciousness? Answer. The infradimensions of nature and of the cosmos not only exist on the planet Earth, but also in any cosmic unity of infinite space. Suns, moons, planets, galaxies, stars, anti-stars, anti-galaxies of antimatter, etc., etc., etc. These natural infradimensions are not then exclusive products of the subconscious or infraconscious of intellective humanoids, but the result of mathematical laws that have their origin in every ray of existential creation. Question. Master, can it be said then that when we refer to consciousness itself, we should think that it is free of time? Answer. Sir, gentlemen, ladies, I want to say in an emphatic manner that in the sacred absolute Sun, time is 48 times faster than here on Earth. On analyzing this statement, we wisely say, since time is the mere subjective creation of the intellectual humanoid, it is obvious that it is 49 times slower than on the sacred absolute Sun. In other words, I clarify that the mind of a humanoid possesses 49 subconscious departments, and because of this, it is said that time here among the three-brained or three-centered bipeds mists called men is 49 times slower than on the sacred absolute sun. Using now the inductive process taught by Aristotle in his Divine Entelechy, we will conclude, if time in the sacred absolute sun is 49 times more rapid than on the intellective level of the humanoid, obviously this means that on the sacred sun, time does not exist. There everything is an eternal instant, an eternal now. When looking now at that which is called conscience, studying it wisely, we will discover the original paradisiac being, virginal, free of every subconscious process beyond time. That is, the conscience in itself is not a product of time. Question. Forgive me, Master, it'll appear a little insistent, but I have grasped the concept that as we awaken consciousness, the infraconscious and subconscious states cease to exist because these become conscious. Is this wrong? Answer. Sir, I think that your question is quite interesting ostensibly. The submerged states of Pluto, let us call them infraconsciousness, unconsciousness, subconsciousness, are radically eliminated when consciousness awakened. In the sixth submerged dimension, time seems too long to us due to the clear and evident fact of the subconscious, unconscious, and infraconscious states. But in nirvana, time does not exist due to the convincing and definite fact that the ego, nor the subconscious, nor the aforementioned abysmal states exist in that divine region. Question. With this explanation that frankly surprises me, because never before had I related time with states of subconsciousness, I arrive at the conclusion that the unconscious, the infraconscious, and the subconscious, of which psychologists speak so much about, are in reality negative and satanic states, and that they are obstacles to man's self-realization. Am I correct, Master? Answer. We have been told in a solemn manner that we need to transform the subconscious into conscious. We also include the infraconscious and unconscious states within these transformative concepts. To awaken, consciousness is radical. It is only in this M that we will be able to see the path that shall lead us final liberation. Obviously, the concept of time, which makes life so bitter in the sixth submerged dimension and in the different Dantestic circles of Tartarus, is definitely eliminated when consciousness awakens. Question. You tell us that the sixth submerged region of Jupiter is the antithesis of the planet Jupiter that orbits around the sun. I observe, Master, when you spoke of other Dantestic circles that you did not refer to them as the antithesis of the planets to which they correspond. Would you like to clarify this for us? Answer. Sir, gentlemen, ladies, obviously, the 9 infernal circles are always the negative, antithetical aspect of the spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. I believe that I have already said something in past lectures about this subject, and that we have already described the relationship existing between those worlds and the 9 zones which are submerged below the epidermis of our planet Earth. Finding a similarity to all of this, you will see that every person under the sunlight projects his shadow everywhere. You will find something similar with each of these 9 worlds of the solar system and their corresponding shadows or obscure, tenebrous zones within the entrails of the planet in which we live. Do you understand? Question. Master, could you tell us if the submerged zone of the planet Jupiter is inhabited? Answer. Distinguished lady, allow me to inform you and to inform all the persons who are listening to me that in the natural infradimensions of the submerged mineral kingdom of the planet Jupiter exist terribly perverse demons, involuting creatures, people who are on their way towards the second death. I clarify, I am not tea about the heaven of Jupiter. I limit myself exclusively to mention the submerged mineral kingdom of that planet. Question: can we consider that in spite of the fact that there are terribly malignant, involuting beings in the infernos of Jupiter, that said infernos are antithetical to the infernos of the sixth Dantistic circle of the planet Earth? Answer: friends, the tenebrous corresponds with the tenebrous. No antithesis whatsoever exists between the Jupiterian infernos and the sixth Dantistic circle submerged below the geological cortex of our world Earth. We should look for antitheses exclusively between the luminous and obscure aspects of Jupiter. Indubitably, the Jupiterian splendors have their opposites, their shadows, not only in the entrails of that radiant planet, but also below the cortex of our afflicted world. Question: Master, could you tell us what are the materials or elements which make up that tenebrous zone of the sixth submerged dimension of our planetary organism? Answer: friends, we have already said in past lectures that the inhabitants of any natural element do not perceive the element in which they live. The fish never see the water. We, the inhabitants of this three-dimensional world of Euclid, never perceive the air that we breathe. We do not see it. The salamanders do not see the fire. Likewise, those who dwell in the petrous rocky element never see such an element. They only perceive objects, persons, events, etc. Obviously, the petrous density of the sixth dwelling of Pluto results unbearable, terribly dense. Now we will understand the reason why Dante saw so many condemned beings inside their sepulchres. They are not sepulchres in the literal sense of the word. With the words sepulchral states, what is meant is very narrow conditions, limited conditions of subconsciousness and infraconsciousness, etc. They are painful conditions of life in the sixth abysmal region.